Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and as the Jewish world celebrates the 65th birthday of the State of Israel with Yom HaAtzmaut, I have the great pleasure of sitting with one of the newest members of the Israeli parliament, Rabbi Dov Lipman of the Yesh Atid party, and perhaps even more important, Dov is the first American-born member of the Knesset in the last 30 years. Let me tell you a little bit about Dov Lipman. Dov is from the Baltimore area, holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University, and received his rabbinic ordination from a modern black hat yeshiva in Baltimore, Yeshivat Ner Yisrael. And much of Dov's work as a member of the Yesh Atid party in the Knesset is to help the Israeli Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, integrate into Israeli society. And Dov Lipman chairs the Knesset lobby for job integration in the Haredi community. And Dov Lipman, it's a pleasure to be sitting with you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're from the Baltimore area, Silver Springs?
Yeah, I grew up in Silver Spring.
Okay. And if I had known you as you were growing up, what kind of kid were you?
You would have seen a kid who was consumed by sports.
Yes.
Redskins, Orioles, Capitals, Bullets. Spent hours in the backyard shooting hoops and dreaming of playing varsity basketball in high school, which I did. In an Orthodox family, kept the Sabbath and kosher laws, and going to a Jewish day school where I combined Judaic studies and general studies. And a young boy who dreamt of being like his dad and becoming an attorney. And my ultimate goal was to be a high-powered trial attorney.
That is your father?
My father was a federal judge, actually, in Washington.
What was his name?
Ronald J. Lipman.
Very lovely. Very lovely. And at some point, the desire to be a judge dissipates?
After high school, I went to Israel, actually, to yeshiva. Got very caught up, in a positive way, I would say, in the ultra-Orthodox yeshiva world in Israel.
And forgive me, in Silver Springs, were you part of the modern Orthodox community?
It's hard to qualify exactly, but we were somewhere between modern Orthodox and yeshiva. You know, in America, you don't really have to box yourself in and identify yourself. Right. And that's actually part of my battle in Israel, is that everyone feels the need to really qualify precisely what type of Jew, just instead of saying, we're Jewish.
At some point you marry.
Yes.
And you have children.
Yes.
Four
children.
4 children.
Yes.
You marry here in the States or in Israel?
Got married here, and we actually lived in Baltimore for a year, and then Cincinnati for 3 years, and then Silver Spring for 6 years.
Okay. And then at some point, you and your wife named
Dina
decide to make Aliyah?
Correct.
Okay. What prompts it, Dov?
Amazingly, the school where I was teaching, I was an educator, the school took the entire high school on a trip to Israel. And they asked for chaperones. And my wife and I went along. It was a subsidized trip. And while we were here, somehow being here, having been married for a number of years at that point, our oldest son at that point was 7, something pulled at us while we were here. We said, why aren't we raising our children in a Jewish country in Israel? And I have to just qualify. Very American family, very patriotic.
You were at that point?
Yes, very much so. This wasn't a question of rejecting anything.
Yes. Did your 7-year-old son root for a basketball team also?
Absolutely. At that point, unfortunately, they were called the Wizards. They were no longer the Bullets, but yes, he did.
So here this American family goes to Israel. You're a Jewish educator in the States, but somehow you said to yourself, I belong here?
Yes. There was something that was pulling at us, and we felt, you know, after 2,000 years as a Jewish people of wandering around from country to country, all of a sudden this opportunity is in front of us where we can live in our homeland. We felt that we had to explore our options. We weren't a family that was willing to just drop everything and figure it out. I had to find work, and we wanted to make sure that things worked out. And once it did, we took the plunge, as they say.
Okay. And did you know you would find work?
No, We looked for work from the States. While we were still living in the United States, I looked for work. It wasn't easy to find a job in education. And if I didn't find work, I wasn't going to move. And this is actually a big belief of mine that people need before they make Aliyah, before you move to Israel, have things in place and make sure you have a plan.
That's very wise.
Yes.
How about your wife? Did she work too?
She worked as well. She was in preschool education, and she was able to find work. We had very young children when we moved here. My youngest daughter was 6 weeks old when we moved, so she was still very much raising the baby at that point, but she was able to find work as well.
And now your son, who we talked about a moment ago, at 7, how old is he now?
He's turning 16, and I can proudly say he's a starting pitcher for the Israel National Little League team.
This is not possible. There is Little League baseball now in
There's
Israel?
Little League baseball, and to see my son this past summer wearing the blue and white and Israel across his chest in Cooperstown, New York,
No.
playing in a
Oh my
baseball
goodness.
tournament was something.
I get chills.
Yes,
I
it
get
was very
chills.
special.
What's his name?
Shlomo.
Shlomo. That is wonderful. Where do you live in Israel now?
We live in Beit Shemesh.
Okay. I read in the notes about you, by the way, I will tell people, you're 41?
Yes.
Yes. I read in the notes that you considered yourself, up to this point in time, really an educator. You've written books. You've written 3 books. You're about to have come up with your 4th. We may talk about that in a moment.
Okay.
But you saw yourself as an educator, and what the notes say is you did not see yourself. You were not looking for a political position. If that's true, how do you end up part of Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party?
Essentially, when we moved to Beit Shemesh, as you said, I was an educator, and that was the plan. Beit Shemesh is a wonderful city. We moved there because we wanted our children to be exposed to Jews from all types of backgrounds, and in our minds, to show them how we can all live in perfect harmony. Without getting to all the details, but we realized that it wasn't so, and there was significant religious extremism. I was actually in a situation where rocks were thrown. And,
At you?
They were thrown at police, actually, at the Israel police. And it's very important for me to emphasize, the average ultra-Orthodox person that you see walking down the street would not be violent towards anyone or hurt anyone. There's an extremist group, though, which is almost allowed to do as they please, and a trigger went off in my mind, and I said, wait a minute, this is not the Jewish country these are not Jewish values. This is not the kind of people that we've ever been. And I decided not necessarily to go into politics, but to try to do something about it, and I became a community activist. After a little while in community activism, you realize that real change happens in government, and that's where the shift made from a career of education to a career of politics.
And then you were a member on the Yesh Atid list. And obviously, Yesh Atid did much better than all of the pundits predicted, yes?
That's correct. First of all, Yesh Atid was not my natural political home. Yair Lapid is a secular icon in Israel.
Correct.
And I became aware of a speech which he gave where he essentially called to the religious community and said, let's work together. Let's break down these barriers. And I felt like it was my responsibility on the religious side to sort of reach out and grab that outstretched hand and work together to try to break down those barriers. The unity issue has always been important to me, the tolerance aspect, and that's certainly a part of my American background as well, where everyone, live and let live and respect every human being, and certainly within the Jewish people to be respecting each other. And that's what Yesh Atid very much represented, but I did not think when I was number 17 on the list that I was going to be a member of Knesset.
How many seats did you get?
We won 19.
19. So you got in by 2 or 3. That's really nice.
Correct.
How do you identify yourself now? How do you self-identify yourself within the Israeli religious structure?
I do continue to identify myself as ultra-Orthodox in terms of the observance of the laws and the like and the customs. I do feel that I'm continuing in that tradition. The Israeli ultra-Orthodox population has really shifted away from the way we've always been. We've always been a people, no matter how religious a person was, that was knowledgeable in the worldly realm, in general studies, in math and science and languages. We were always a people.
I want you to talk about that more, because there are many American Jews, many Americans in general, but even American Jews, who somehow believe that a general education for a, quote, Orthodox Jew is in some way oxymoron, and that in fact you're saying quite the opposite. You're saying that the Jewish tradition has always said that the educated Jew, educated in halakha, Jewish law, Jewish practice, Jewish commitment, is also a well-educated person in general. Do I hear you correctly?
You hear me correctly, and I'll take it a step further. It actually is part and parcel of the religious side of who we are as a people. Maimonides, in the very beginning of his work, says there's a law to love God, but he says, how do you perform that law? What's the act? And he says, it's to study the wisdom of creation. He says it straight, and then he spends about 2.5 chapters teaching science the way he understood it at that time. In the most integral work on Torah thought and Torah law, he begins by teaching science. So you see that right there. The Talmud itself is filled with mathematics, even in dealing in halakha. So it's not just that, yes, we need to have Torah and general studies. They work together as part and parcel of one another, and they've drifted from that path. So therefore, we're just, from my perspective, we're reinstating what we've always been about.
I hope everybody hears you. I love the way you say it. You know, there is a bracha la'asok b'divrei Torah, and which is normally translated to be engaged in or to be busy in the study of Torah. And the question is, what does Torah mean? And obviously, to the Jew, it begins with everything having to do with Jewish sources, rabbinic literature. But in some way, I have always felt that if a Jew studies chemistry, medicine, science, culture, the arts, that also is Torah. Are you comfortable with that?
Very much so. My teacher in Ner Israel, the head of the yeshiva, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg of blessed memory, he taught me that God revealed himself to the world twice. One was at Sinai, and that's why we study the Torah, which he transmitted to us at Sinai. But he revealed himself before that when he created the world. And just like we study his revelation at Sinai, we must, to know God or to understand God and to connect to God, we must also study the revelation in creation.
Okay. I love the way you say it. Can you talk for one moment why you believe the voice you have just spoken in is not a voice most American Jews hear coming out of the Orthodox community?
It's difficult to put my finger on it. I do think a lot of it comes from Israel. I really believe that once the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel became more extreme and pulled away, then Jewry is very much pulled by it. And therefore, I'm very confident that as we make these transformations within the Israeli ultra-Orthodox population, and again, I don't even call them transformation, it's going back to the way we've always been, I do hope that American Jewry will follow. And there won't be this need to try to identify myself as more religious by becoming more extreme. Let's start looking internally to define ourselves as more religious instead of just by these trappings and the externals.
One more question about this sociologically, then we'll turn really to Israel. In some way, you understand that there are going to be people looking at Shalom TV right now, and they're going to look at you, and they won't think of you as a, quote, ultra-Orthodox Jew. The reason is the ultra-Orthodox have, in most people's minds, a certain look. Payas, a long beard, you have neither. You are not wearing anything other than a yarmulke. You do not walk in here as Rabbi Lau might do with a hat on. And there is a popular stereotype of what an ultra-Orthodox Jew looks like. You could be a very serious Jew, a mainstream Orthodox Jew who takes halacha, you're shomer mitzvot, you observe Shabbat, you observe kashrut, you observe laws of purity, you do all of the chagim, but the American Jew would not associate you with ultra-Orthodox, which in the American Jewish experience now associates that with a certain kind of extremism that is angry at anything that is less than Orthodox Judaism. So I want you to speak to our audience about, for lack of a better, your appearance. You don't appear to be an ultra-Orthodox Jew. I want to say to you, and by the way, you don't speak like one. You are so, and this is going to sound, I was going to say you sound so lovely. It's not like I have not met lovely ultra-Orthodox Jews. I have. But there is nothing about your look, your demeanor, the words that come out of your mouth that is associated with ultra-Orthodoxy. Speak to that, Dov.
Well, that's specifically why I identify myself as ultra-Orthodox, because if ultra-Orthodox means extremist, anti-Zionist, not believing in work, only wearing a white shirt, and the like, then I'm not ultra-Orthodox. The problem is that there's a huge population in Israel that identify themselves as ultra-Orthodox who are not in the terms I just described. They are people who want to work, they want to be educated, they want to have a little bit of more freedom in terms of even the way that they dress, and they have no representation because in Israel, and now I'm shifting to politics for a moment and I apologize, the ultra-Orthodox parties very much identify the extremist side of things, and no one has been representing what I view as the mainstream, who understand that you can combine the two together. So that's why it's very important for me to continue to identify myself as ultra-Orthodox. I do, by the way, for prayers, wear the hat, and it is a part of who I am, and it does help me actually personally in terms of, there's no religious significance to it, but it's just the way I've prayed. And it's very important. And what's happened the last 2 months since I entered Knesset is they've started to be in touch with me, and they want
Who's they?
The moderate ultra-Orthodox, or what I call the old ultra-Orthodox, which is people who feel that there's no one in the government level who's really representing their needs, where you can say, I can be fervently Orthodox, I can maintain all the traditions, but still serve in the military, do national service, have general education, and go to work, and there's not a contradiction. And that's so important, because the moment you feel that to be ultra-Orthodox, you can't do those other things, so then the average child is stuck. Do I follow my dream to be a doctor, or do I sit in the yeshiva? Do I follow my dream to be a soldier, or do I have to stay in the yeshiva? And what we're trying to show, and I'm trying to show, is that you can do both, and they're not mutually exclusive.
Forgive me, I want to press you a little bit more.
Sure.
I don't know how many of our viewers have ever been in Bnei Brak, which is a very interesting community, but the Petach Tikva Bnei Brak experiences are interesting in that you can be in a car driving down a main street, and you will see different garb, Jews dress differently. One of the things that they will do is wear different kinds of yarmulke, kippah, okay? And there's this understanding that you identify people by the type of yarmulke they wear. You understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying. I disagree with the approach in general, but I understand that people do that.
Okay. Are you saying, though, that there is not a sociological reality to that? That you do see communities somehow adopting a similar yarmulke as not a uniform, but it does in some way indicate where they are comfortable, in which community they are comfortable in. And there's the knitted yarmulke, and then there's the kind of yarmulke you're wearing, and then there's the yarmulke that's even larger, et cetera, et cetera. And are you saying to me that sociologically it's not true, or are you saying you wish it weren't true?
I wish it weren't true.
Yes.
I've learned in my 8.5 years living in Israel that there could be people walking down the street with no yarmulke on their head who could be more spiritual and better people than myself with my yarmulke and my tzitzit and everything else. And we need to get to a point where no one notices yes kippah, yes yarmulke, no yarmulke, and all of these externals. The externals should help individuals with their own spirituality and should not be a basis for any kind of judgments at all. And that's my ultimate goal. I might not live to see it in practice.
Well, that's the next question. My next question for you was going to be, whom do you represent? Because I speak to people all the time. You are enormously impressive. I just don't know whether you're a voice in the wilderness, whether you're basically speaking for yourself, or whether, Dov, there really is a constituency you're speaking with and for.
There really is a constituency, and this I take very seriously. It's a very quiet constituency. It's a constituency which lives under a fear of standing up and saying what they actually believe. A fear, because when you're in a certain system, if you go against the system, so then it impacts your children, it impacts your wife, it impacts marriages down the line, and it's very difficult. There is an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who sat in my dining room and said to me that my political party, which is calling for general education in the schools, which is calling for military service, again, with sensitivity to the ultra-Orthodox needs, but we're calling for it, he said, we are going to save the ultra-Orthodox community from themselves, because sometimes you need an outside force to come in and, again, with taking care of their spiritual needs, releasing them from the system in which they're in. And that is what we're doing. And therefore, I very much represent that very quiet, but I do believe huge percentage within the family looks at their children. They have 8 children. Let's say 5 sons. I'm just throwing out numbers here. how many of those 5 sons can actually study the Torah day and night for the rest of their lives? How many of them see their sons who just want to go play ball, they want to go do something else, and they're kept in a system where they're not able to do so? How many of them want their children to be destined for poverty? Because in the system, they're destined for poverty. They know that. They don't want that. And the moment that they understand that someone could provide them with a framework where they could still be fervently ultra-Orthodox, study Torah, be Talmudic scholars, but be able to have the general studies, to be able to sustain their families properly, and just be a little bit more normal, I believe that they want it and they're even excited about it.
As an American Jew, again, hearing what you say, it is consistent with an American Jewish pluralistic view. I can only imagine there are in Israel Haredim who hear you speak and consider you to be, if not a traitor, someone who is sowing the seeds for the destruction of the Torah Talmud scholar, and that while you talk about poverty, this community has existed in Israel before the state existed. It has certainly been existing for the last 60 years. Somehow they've managed. They've tried to turn out Talmud scholars. They've turned out some extraordinary scholars. And then they've turned out average scholars. And I could see a Haredi family saying, you know, what's Dov talking about? This is the life we believe in. And we really want the opportunity to devote our lives and our children to a certain form of Jewish existence, and if it means poverty, money isn't that important, and not only that, the community, not the state, the community should support Jewish study and scholarship, and if it were not for us, there would be no Jewish future. So I'm wondering whether there are people or groups within the more formal Haredi community that we're used to who either demonize you or in some way are expressing some real objection to the stands you're taking?
The answer is yes. There is demonization, there is rejection, there are attempts to suggest that I'm not ultra-Orthodox, that I'm only interested in this for the power and for the publicity, I hear these types of things all the time. If I felt for a moment that I was going to cause any breakdown in terms of Torah scholarship and in terms of religious observance, I would never be involved in the movement that I'm involved with. But I know, and this is where my American experience does kick in, that you can have an institution. I went to Ner Israel in Baltimore, where not only did we go to university, we went to a non-Jewish university. We left the yeshiva campus every day in the late afternoon for a few hours of college courses, and we produced Torah scholars of the highest caliber, religiously observant in the highest of levels, and there's no contradiction. In fact, I think it strengthens it. So I can understand why someone who hasn't experienced that is concerned, is nervous, and doesn't know where this is heading. But I'm confident that in the end of the day, it'll only strengthen the ultra-Orthodox community, because right now, like I said before, young men who don't want what the current system is offering leave the fold. Leave the fold in very high percentages. And this change will enable that scholarship to continue. Let's remember, just for a moment to digress, in our plan, 1,800 young men per year will be exempt from any kind of service, and they can just study Torah exclusively. So we have that in place. We have the idea.
This is the Yesh Atid plan.
The Yesh Atid plan, which is now going to be the government plan. So that's very important. No one's saying everyone must leave the study halls. We're saying it'll be there. Every other young man can study from 18 to 21 undisturbed before the service plan kicks in. So we are valuing the Torah study, we're valuing where they're coming from, but just saying that we need the combination. Just to add one last point, you mentioned before, leave us alone, let us live our lifestyle. Economically, it doesn't work, and that's also important. You cannot have a country where a population, which thank God is growing in leaps and bounds. There are Jews populating the world, which is wonderful, but that cannot sustain itself living off of everyone else who's working and paying their taxes. At a certain point, the system will collapse. So we're also looking forward, and we're saying, you know what, in 20 years, this is going to be a catastrophe for the whole country with an ideology which says we don't join the workforce. So, and like I said before, there are many, many, many who want this change to take place. This is not some outsiders coming in and forcing people to do something they don't want to do. Inside the community, this change will be welcome.
Okay. I need you to help our audience understand what's the difference between you call yourself an ultra-Orthodox Jew, and a committed Orthodox Jew without the word ultra in front of it. Because again, I just hear you speak, I get a sense of you, and I can't imagine how you would be any different than a very serious American Orthodox Jew who tries to be, and from his perspective, is a wholly observant Jew. But like your father was a judge, he gets up in the morning, he goes to work, he's a productive individual, but he's at the shul for 3 services a day, and he's on Sukkot, he's in the sukkah. What makes you ultra-Orthodox as opposed to just a mainstream Orthodox Jew?
Right. So my first answer might puzzle everyone even more, and that is, I don't know. I don't know where this notion of I'm ultra, and then what is somebody else ultra, and then where are we going in terms of trying to outdo each other? What I know is that I'm a product of a yeshiva world, which in Israel is called the Haredi, it's called ultra-Orthodox. I studied in those yeshivot. I look around the boys around me, I'm dressed the way they were dressed. The only nuance, and again, this is so insignificant to me in terms of calling myself that versus other people, because I'm really not in the business of judging others. There is, in raising our children, a high degree of gender separation. It's not something which we're overly intense about, but they don't really socialize together as they're growing up. But in the American yeshiva world, it's the same way. So a lot of people say I should say I'm American Haredi, I'm American Ultra-Orthodox. And I'm wondering how long our titles are going to become as we try to qualify each other. And that's why the ultimate goal, and I mean this, and I know there's a wide audience that's listening, is that people can say, I'm Jewish, and we can just accept each other as being Jews without having to delve into these details of exactly what each person does. By the way, that also extends from my perspective to the non-Jewish population in the sense that we're not in the business of judging people. People are human beings, and God created all of us in God's image, and I think we've lost our way a little bit in terms of that over the last years.
I said before I wanted to hear what you would say about Jewish pluralism. So, for example, if you could influence how Israeli society works, would you want non-Orthodox rabbis to have the same power, authority, and responsibility, and to be paid by the government the same way select Orthodox rabbis are treated by the government?
So let me first say, I'm Orthodox. I believe passionately in my orthodoxy. I've written books about it, I've taught about it, and I will stand up and debate anyone about why I believe that. But I don't have the right to force that on somebody else. I just don't have the right to do that. People have free choice, and they need to be able to make their own decisions. Israel is a complicated place because it's a Jewish and democratic state. And those two terminologies are very difficult to balance because Jewish, democratic. What does that mean in terms of the non-Jews who live in Israel and the like? I believe either we fund all streams of Judaism or we fund no streams of Judaism. And actually, that's my preference. My preference would be to separate, to get to the point where we can separate religion and politics, not religion and state. We're a Jewish country, but it should be out of the political realm and the open marketplace of ideas. And then it's my responsibility to inspire people to orthodoxy. So to get to your question specifically, we should not be paying specifically one group of rabbis and not paying the others.
Okay. So should a non-Orthodox rabbi be allowed to be a Mesader Kiddushin, stand at a chuppah with 2 Jews, and that wedding be sanctioned by the State of Israel?
Well, let's remember, and now I'm getting into Jewish law, there is nothing mentioned in any of the classic sources about the rabbi at any marriage ceremony.
You're absolutely right, but it's not the way Israel works, is it?
That's correct. So one of the things that we have to do is get back to understanding what is the definition of a Jewish wedding and what's not. Our party, Yesh Atid, we all work together, religious and secular people together, to figure out what is our doctrine in terms of these issues. And even here, I think it's wrong to force someone to marry the way I believe we should get married. Again, I'd love to inspire, embrace people, get people to the point where they want to do it, but we've done a very poor job in Israel in terms of pushing people away because of our demands. And therefore, we've come up with a doctrine which basically says that marriage is defined according to the way halakha has always defined it, but there's also an option for civil unions. And in that way, we're not sanctioning it as marriage, but people want to get married in their own way, want to live together in their own way, in a formal way with rights and the like. That is where the compromise we're trying to work out.
I'm sorry, I almost followed it.
Okay.
At the very end, I missed it. I thought you were saying that because you are committed to this notion that while you would love people to embrace orthodoxy and halakha as you understand it, you are not about to force them to do so. Therefore, I thought you would say, you want to be married under a chuppah with a conservative rabbi or a reform rabbi, or really in Jewish law, you don't need a rabbi at all.
Correct.
The state should sanction whatever marriage ceremony you have. Then at the very end, you turned it around and sort of like we're hearing here in America with this gay marriage issue. No, I'm only in favor of civil unions. So explain to me what you really mean.
Sure. The compromise that we're trying to work out, and again, remember that we're trying to bring an entire Orthodox population along, and we're trying to please a secular population, and this requires compromise. And the compromise, which we are working on in terms of legislation, is going to be that your options are a Jewish marriage, okay, which means people saying Kedat Moshe Yisrael, we're following it and getting married
Yes,
according
but
to
you
the
already
way.
have said that what Kedat Moshe Yisrael, which means according to the laws of Moses and Israel, although you'd love that statement to reflect your understanding of Torah and Sinai, it is conceivable that a non-Orthodox Jew could say and would want to say Kedat Moshe Yisrael.
Oh, that's fine.
And if they were to say Kedat Moshe Yisrael, but an Orthodox rabbi is not what's called technically a Mesader Kedushin. The rabbi has no power.
Right.
Rabbis do not marry Jews. It's a huge misunderstanding in the
Correct.
American Jewish community.
Correct.
Rabbis have no power.
Correct.
Rabbis have no power. All they have is their ability to persuade and to teach and to influence. But rabbis are not closer to God. Rabbis don't represent God. Rabbis have no power. Okay. The Mesader's Kedushin's job is to make sure the man and the woman, the bride and the groom, do it according to Jewish law,
right,
and do the Jewish ceremony properly.
Correct.
Okay. And I'm asking you, are you saying to me that if two non-Orthodox Jews want under a chuppah to say Kedat Moshe Yisrael, and the Mesader Kedushin is not an Orthodox rabbi, the state of Israel will say in their documents at City Hall, so and so and so and so, Poloni and Poloni are both married?
Yes, assuming that that was done, meaning forget the rabbi's stream for a
Yes.
moment, assuming that they did it according to the ground rules of Kedat Moshe Yisrael, then the answer is yes, in terms of the witnesses, which is the real part, which makes the difference in halakha. The reason why I brought up the civil unions is because there are many Jews who don't want to have to get married in a religious ceremony of
At
any
all.
kind.
Yes, that's correct.
And therefore, I feel that it's wrong to force people to
Okay,
get
you
married
wanna
in a
even-
religious
you wanna
setting.
make it even broader
that's
than
what,
I do.
That's why I brought that
Okay.
up. I went broader
Okay.
than that.
Okay.
I just want to correct one thing that you said in terms of the rabbis. I agree they have no power. I'm going to go a step further. This is my line, and this is the message I try to convey to people. Rabbis should not be here to create problems. Rabbis should be here to solve problems. And I think that we've shifted over the years to rabbis creating problems instead of rabbis trying to solve
That's
problems.
very beautiful. But wait, I want to make sure everybody knows because I wasn't clear enough. You have smicha. You are a rabbi.
Yes.
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 And so that what you're saying here, it's not simply you're an educator. It's not simply you have a master's from Johns Hopkins. You also have smicha from a very respected Orthodox yeshiva in Baltimore.
Correct.
Okay. And what about your willingness to permit either a third section at the wall or in some way a non-Orthodox couple, man and woman, want to stand together at the wall? And I don't mean by Robinson's Arch. I mean on the plaza that's in front of the wall.
Right.
Or Anat Hoffman wants to bring a Torah in her arms right up to the wall and do whatever she wants to do and pray and read the Torah at the wall. Do you believe Israel should permit a non-Orthodox expression of Judaism at the Western Wall?
So my broad answer is yes, but I just want to give a few different qualifications. The non-Orthodox community in Israel, or in the secular community, has not demanded that we take down the mechitza, the separation barrier, and I think that's out of an understanding that that would mean that Orthodox people cannot pray at the wall.
Correct.
No one has ever brought that up. There's an understanding
including
that we want.
Hoffman.
Correct.
Right.
So when I think about that, I say to myself, so then why are we creating a scenario where they can't pray at the wall the way they want to? Now, the reason why I want to qualify is because there are different gradations. For example, the talit issue. Let's start with that. It's so important to point out that with the exception of a few minor opinions here or there, there's nothing in halacha, in Jewish law, which prohibits the woman from wearing a talit. We don't in Orthodoxy. That's the custom. There are a variety of reasons for it, but we don't. But even when a woman does, according to some opinions, she's not violating anything. But even more importantly, it's not disturbing me. I go to my side and I pray. I don't understand why we've made an issue out of this. So she's putting on a talit. It bothers me, doesn't bother me. It's not violating halacha for you. The red line should be, is she forcing you to violate a Jewish law? She's not. So I don't understand why we've made an issue in terms of that. It doesn't defile the place. There's nothing happening. We're not talking about women who want to get together. Listen, if we're talking about singing, dancing, etc., while again, I might personally say, let them do whatever they want to do, I can understand that there we're starting to, wait a minute, there are men on the other side, there might be men who don't want to hear that at all. We're starting to infringe on people's rights, and I understand we have to be sensitive on all sides in terms of religious coercion. But the talit issue, from my perspective, is a nonsensical issue. We've taken an issue which should be a non-issue and made it into this issue, and that's the biggest mistake. Nathan Sharansky's plan is that the Robinson's Arch area should be raised and equal. They're going to do construction, and there will be the men's, the women's, and the egalitarian. I'm totally comfortable with that.
I am too.
But I want to say something, and that is, if the extremist parties have control in government, they're going to fight that as well.
Absolutely.
And that is why what we've done in our party and said that we are creating a government without extremist influence because they're not willing to budge on any issue which is so critical. And that's why it's a very optimistic and hopeful time in Israel, because we can make real changes that are necessary to enable all Jews to feel comfortable in Israel.
You are the 17th member on the Yesh Atid list. Yair Lapid is number 1. To what extent do you voice a perspective which you think the 16 other members who are, quote, above you, or even Yair Lapid himself, to what extent do you feel you're able to voice and articulate a position that virtually every member of the Yesh Atid party would adopt?
I can honestly say that this is the position of the party. The way I know that is because we've worked this out together. Yair said, the religion and state issues have been the third rail of Israeli politics. Nobody wants to touch it. It's the downfall. We said, no, we have to touch it. We have to tackle it. We, within the party, worked on a doctrine, and it was difficult. It was painful. There were arguments. There was discussion, and that's what it should be all about. You have to break down the walls and work it out together. So everything that I'm saying is what Yair would say, with one exception. I started out by saying I'm Orthodox and I'm passionate about it. He would say he's not Orthodox.
Correct.
He's secular and he's passionate about that, but we're willing to work together and try to move things forward in Israel.
And if there were an Eric Yaffe or a Rick Jacobs or a Julie Schoenfeld or Arnie Eisen, David Ellenson, all of the leaders of non-Orthodox Judaism here in America, and I had them at this table, they would express a Jewish view of Israel very similar to yours. You understand that?
I do understand that.
Would there be any significant difference if I had a Rick Jacobs, who now heads the Reform Movement's congregational arm, if I had Arnie Eisen from JTS sitting next to you? Would there be some area that you and he would disagree with in terms of Jewish social policy in the state of Israel?
My assumption, and I haven't had the conversation, is that they would hope to see a world where in every area of Jewish life, Reform Judaism could be fully practiced and accepted
Absolutely.
in Israel. The one area where I would say we need to find a way to compromise, and I couldn't say that, is on the conversion issue.
Yes.
Because since that's defining who's a Jew, that's not an area where I can say, everybody find your own way, because we'll have a disaster in terms of trying to sort through all of that. I do think, though, we need to try to find a way to find some kind of a comprehensive plan where, on the Orthodox side, we're more lenient. Within halakha, there are many opinions about many issues, especially Jews of Jewish descent. In Hebrew, it's Zera Yisrael. And the Reform conservative communities would have to say, you know what, maybe all of our conversions won't be acceptable, but a large percentage will, and we work together and try to find that unified policy. I'm not saying we'd be successful, but we owe it to ourselves in the future to try.
But I want you to try to explain to our audience the practical consequence of the fact that there is at the moment a different approach to conversion. Give our audience an example of how this could, in real life, present a problem, and an Arnie Eisen or a Rick Jacobs would go in one direction, and you and Yesh Atid would go in a different direction.
The issue of controversy in conversions relates to acceptance of the mitzvot. When the person becomes a Jew, how do they demonstrate their commitment to being part of the Jewish people? And traditionally, that was done through their acceptance of, I'm going to now be performing mitzvot. It's very gray. What does that mean, performance of mitzvot?
It certainly is gray. Based on the way you describe Judaism and your willingness to embrace everybody's approach, it's very gray. Give me a specific example where something would happen and you think the leaders of American non-Orthodox Judaism would disagree with what you would like to see happen in Israel.
I would want to see conversions where people accept certain basics upon themselves. Not all the mitzvot, but based on what we've seen in the sources, there has to be some basic...
I'm not being clear enough. I apologize to you.
That's fine.
Give me a hypothetical. Are you saying to me there is a non-Jew in Israel who wants to be a Jew?
I'm saying
Are you saying there's a Russian, somebody who grew up in Russia, whose father was Jewish?
No, that we'd agree about.
You have no trouble with that?
Because that's the area of Jewish descent where it's very clear.
But don't suggest that every Orthodox Jew agrees with you.
I don't suggest that, but that's
you don't think you would have a problem?
Correct.
But I'm saying to you, let's suppose that we have somebody who is not Jewish on both sides. Neither parent is Jewish, and now this individual is in love with a Jew and wants to marry that Jew. And that individual who lives in Israel, not in America, but in Israel, wants to convert. This is, in your mind, the possible area where there's conflict between you and American non-Orthodox Judaism. Do I have it right?
Yes.
Now, you would imagine that a non-Orthodox Jew in Israel would say, a non-Orthodox rabbi would say, you will study, you will learn, you'll make a declaration of commitment. We may ask you to do certain things. We may ask you to be part of the Jewish community for a while. And when we feel you are ready, we will have a conversion ceremony. And you would say, no, for me, that isn't good enough. I want this individual to in some way make a commitment to being Shomer Shabbat or Shomer Kashrut, or to observe all the holidays. What would you want that you're afraid that a Rick Jacobs or a Julie Schoenfeld wouldn't demand of a convert who's converting in Israel? The reason I want to make sure our audience understands, at the moment, if a non-Jew converts outside of Israel, doesn't matter how, doesn't matter which rabbi was involved, doesn't matter what bet din, if the conversion was outside the state of Israel, Israel accepts that individual as a Jew. But in Israel, the conversion process is not in any way as broad. I want to understand, in Israel, what would you want as opposed to what, again, a Rick Jacobs or a Julie Schoenfeld would want?
So I'm actually going to surprise you. I actually believe, and based on all the sources, that in Israel, we can be far more lenient than outside of Israel. Because in Israel today, there's a type of Judaism, which is people who it's cultural in nature. They make Kiddush on Friday night. They light candles. There's a concept of Passover, of Pesach. There's a concept of Yom Kippur. 90-some-odd% of Israelis fast. So in Israel, identifying yourself as Jewish should require less of a statement of how much I will actually perform than outside of Israel. So I'm turning the tables, and I'm saying that in Israel itself, I think we could find a lot more room for agreement with other streams than outside of Israel. Because outside of Israel, it gets complicated, because how do we identify this person as Jewish? They're not speaking Hebrew, there's no service to the Israeli army, which is serving the Jewish people, which is a huge mitzvah and a huge statement of commitment. Let's remember, just to take a step back before that, the conversion that we see in the Bible is Ruth saying, your people are my people, a commitment to be part of the Jewish people. Over the years, that's been defined as how you're performing the mitzvot. In Israel, it's much easier to identify a person as Jewish, as committed, outside of the realm of the specific level of mitzvot that they're performing. So I think that in Israel, we'd have a much easier time. My issue would actually be the conversions from outside of Israel, which they tried to create that policy. In Israel, I think we can actually do it. And that's why I believe that's one of our challenges today, is to sit down and hammer out a policy for conversion which we can all agree about to identify what it means to have a conversion in Israel.
Okay. I find it fascinating, but I don't hear an answer. I don't hear you're able to give me an example of how you think your position on conversion in Israel would differ from Rick Jacobs.
I'm being very honest, and I need to hear what exactly the criteria would be.
So the answer is you don't know at the moment.
I don't know.
Fair. Yeah. I give you credit for saying I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to just make a statement, and I want you to comment on it.
Okay.
I have developed a very, very wonderful friend through Shalom TV. An individual who watches in Seattle and emails me all the time, watches everything. I get chills thinking of her. Her name is Linda. And Linda has railed against the way in which a certain kind of ultra-Orthodoxy has dominated social policy in Israel, the wall just being an example, the Western Wall. And I've said to her that nothing will change until the Israeli people want it to change. It's not about what American Jews want in Israel. It's about what Israelis want. And from what my observations have been, that within Israel, the Israeli people have not been upset enough with the Haredi community and the Haredi lifestyle, and therefore they don't even visit the wall. There are Jews who, in Israel, who've never been to the Western Wall, may never have been to Jerusalem. Do they care whether or not Hoffman gets to pray at the wall? They do not. Do they care about Haredi life? They do not, until it impinges upon them. And Linda said to me, you wait. Within a very short period of time, the Israeli people, not the American Jews in New York and Baltimore and Boston and Philadelphia and Connecticut and all over the country, Los Angeles, Chicago, no. It's not that. There will be Jews in Israel, just mainstream, ordinary Jews, who call themselves secular, even if they have a kiddush and a seder. And at some point, they will rail themselves against structures created by a political system that has given the ultra-Orthodox parties, not the ones you represent, a disproportionate amount of power and clout that has created a social system when it comes to things having to do with family life and divorce and marriage and Western Wall prayer. And the question is, at what point will that happen? And my answer to her was, it will only happen if there's an economic ramification. If suddenly the average Israeli feels threatened economically, he may notice the inequity of the system that was created in the early 50s when our founding fathers in the state of Israel made certain compromises to make everybody happy. That introduction to this question, is that where we are now? Is it your sense that the average Israeli in Bet Shemesh, in Ra'anana, in anywhere in Israel, they've just had it because, as you said earlier in our discussion, the system being created by the ultra-Orthodox doesn't allow for economically to sustain the system, and that ultimately people feel that everybody has a responsibility now to be part of national service, whether it's military or something else. So my question for you is, to what extent is this, this prediction Linda had, is it coming true because, in fact, the average Israeli individual now feels he is somehow personally threatened, economically or some other way, by a Haredi lifestyle.
It's 100% true, and it's actually such an important point because no one is coming to this. We're not coming to this from being anti-Haredi or hating ultra-Orthodox. Ultra-Orthodox people, and it's important for the audience to hear this, the most wonderful people. There's a lot of chesed, there's a lot of acts of kindness. They're good people. The people that will be violent and the like are very minimal in terms of numbers. And it's so important when we discuss this issue that no one should feel like we're railing against ultra-Orthodox people as being horrible people. Yair Lapid, our party's success in the elections, the 19 seats that we won, were very much built off the fact that we can no longer continue this system. It's not against the people, it's against the system. Yair said this throughout the campaign, at every campaign stop. He said in our last faction meeting when the government was being formed, he reached out to ultra-Orthodox people and said, try us, we're here to help you. We're here to call on us. We're here to help you. We want to help you get to work, help you sustain your families, and get a system in place which is functional for a country. But it's absolutely true that the average Israeli, the issues of the Western Wall and the like weren't really major issues. By the way, I'm sad about that we've sort of pushed people out of the Jewish realm, and it's become the religious that have that monopoly, so to speak, on religion. So both things are changing. Number one, we will address it on an economic level, but Yesh Atid also very much believes in trying to bring Judaism and Torah to the broader community as well. Not in terms of outreach, we're going to make you more religious, just that this is all of ours, and there are personalities in our party that have really brought this to the fore.
I've said this off camera, you are fabulous, and this has to only be part one. We're about to end. I want to ask you to just do one last thing for me. You and I are taping this in the shadow of Yom HaAtzmaut, and the shadow is the wrong word, in the bright light of Yom HaAtzmaut, as we're about to celebrate Israel's 65th anniversary. I want you to take 60 seconds, Dov. Tell me what it is that excites you so much. Talk for 1 minute about the wonder of the state of Israel today.
Very clear. As a young boy growing up in Silver Spring, Maryland, we went a few times a year to the Soviet embassy to protest for Soviet Jewry. In one of those demonstrations, I was holding a sign, this young American kid, free Yuli Edelstein. And today, I sit in a parliament chamber in Jerusalem as a member of Knesset with Yuli Edelstein as the speaker of that parliament. If that doesn't say that we're living in magnificent times, in miraculous times, in exciting times, nothing else can say it. And when we celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day, we have to look back and say, look at us. Look at us. My grandmother walked out of Auschwitz in the early months of 1945, and she has a grandson serving in an autonomous Jewish state in the parliament. There are miraculous things happening. There are majestic things happening, and that's the celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut.
You are out of this world. Yotzei min haklal. I wish you all the best. Kol tuv hatzlacha. You must promise. I will not let you go until you promise you'll come back very, very soon.
It would be my honor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're wonderful.
Thank you.
The thoughts of Dov Lipman, a member of Yesh Atid party and the chair of the Knesset lobby for job integration in the Haredi community. My guess is you have not heard someone present a view of orthodoxy and Jewish life the way Dov Lipman has, and it was an honor for me to meet with you. Really, I'm so glad we are now friends, Dov.
Thank you so much.
As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have. To the thoughts expressed by Dov Lipman, please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. And if you'd like to be in touch with Dov yourself, you can email me, and I will forward your emails on to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.